New month, new challenge. For the month of August, I'll be reading the book of Enoch. Enoch is the great-grandfather of Noah. There's not much about him in the Bible besides the fact that he lived for 365 years. He had many sons and daughters, but the son that was mentioned in the Bible is called Methuselah. Methuselah was the father of Lamech, who is the father of Noah. The book of Enoch is not accepted by Christians or Jews as part of their religious text. The book itself is about angels and devils, and I just want to check it out and see what it talks about. So let's begin. Chapter 1 begins with the word and the blessing of Enoch. It's a very, very short chapter. In this chapter, it says that Enoch was a righteous man and he gets a vision from God about the end times. When the end time comes, God will make peace with those that are righteous, but for those that are wicked, they will be destroyed. Some physical signs of this happening is that there will be a lot of trembling in nature. There will be a lot of destruction of nature. So in verse 6, it says that the high mountains will be shaken, and the high hills shall be made low, and shall melt like wax before the flame. The timing of this event is kept very vague. It doesn't say specifically what time. In verse 2, it does say that it's not for the current generation, I'm assuming Enoch's generation, but for a generation to come, which could be any generation in the future. Day 2 of reading the book of Enoch. Today's chapter is called The Creation, and it's another short chapter. As I was reading through this chapter, I felt like I was reading the Bible. In this chapter, I would say that there is a contrast between nature and humans. Nature obeys God. Nature does not stray from God's commandments, but people do. In the first few verses, it talks about winter and summer and how in winter the trees shed their leaves, but in the summer the leaves come back, and depending on the tree, they may bear fruit. So I would say that in verses 1 to 7, the chapter talks about how nature essentially obeys God and glorifies God, but in verse 8, humans do not obey God. They do not keep God's commandments. There is a distinction between those who are disobedient and those that are righteous. And there's a mention of those that are elect. I'm not sure if those that are righteous and the ones that are elect are the same people. Verse 9 talks about the consequences of disobedience. It says that the years of your life shall perish, and the years of your destruction shall be multiplied in eternal abomination, and ye shall find no mercy. That continues in verse 10, but the chapter does end off with how those that are righteous are rewarded. In verse 15, it says, they shall all live and never again sin, either through ungodliness or through pride. And then in verse 17, and their lives shall be increased in peace, and the years of their joy shall be multiplied in eternal gladness and peace all the days of their life. This chapter sounds like a passage from the Bible, but it also reminds me of the Quran because there's this emphasis on the consequences of those that obey and disobey God. Those that disobey God will suffer, but those that obey God will be rewarded and blessed. Day 3 of reading the book of Enoch. This chapter is titled Fallen Angels, and things get kind of crazy in this chapter. In verse 2, it mentions the angels who are the children of heaven, which makes me question, how do heavenly beings procreate? Is it the same as humans? These angels saw daughters of men, and they were so beautiful that they wanted to marry them. Samjeza, the leader of the angels, didn't want to bear the consequence of this deed alone, so he made all of the angels who were also interested in marrying humans swear an oath together, and they said that there were 200 angels who did this. Verse 6 gives 19 names of leaders. I'm assuming that 19 plus the leader that was mentioned previously makes 20. So I'm assuming that each of the 20 leaders were in charge of 9 other angels. So these angels had sexual relations with humans, so they took them as wives, but also with animals. as mentioned in verse 10. When angels and humans married and had children, those children were giants. And in verse 9 it said that when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. Not too sure what that means. Were all humans killed off, or were they eaten by giants? In verse 10 there is, I guess, bestiality. I think that's the term. But the last sentence of this verse says, the earth laid accusations against the lawless ones. I'm not too sure what that sentence means. Verse 11 mentions Azazel, who taught men to make items of war, essentially. But he was not listed as one of the leaders in verse 6. So I'm not entirely sure who he is. He's probably one of the angels, but it didn't seem like he had any leadership roles. At least his name wasn't mentioned. In verse 13, it sounds like the angels were teaching humans astrology, moon signs, star signs, and enchantments, so spells, as well as root cuttings, which I'm not sure if I see them as bad things. I know that enchantments can be bad, but why is it corrupt for humans to learn about how the moon and the sun work? Maybe it goes beyond just intellect. The last verse of this chapter closes off with a very sorrowful verse. It says, and as men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven. I'm not sure why the men were perishing. Is it because the giants were out competing them with resources, or were they being attacked by giants? Day 4 of reading the book of Enoch. Today's chapter is called Intercession of Angels. In the beginning of this chapter, there are a number of angels that cry out to God. These angels include Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. Gabriel is an angel that appears in the Bible. Maybe Michael too, but I'm not sure. I found the scenario a bit odd because God is all-knowing and he is all-powerful. So he knew what was going on. If this was true, he would know that this was going on. So it's odd that his angels had to bring up these events to God for him to intervene. Moving on to verse 5, it says, thou seest what Azazel hath done, who hath taught all unrighteousness on earth, and revealed the eternal secrets which were in heaven, which men were striving to learn. In the previous chapter, there was a list of the angels and what that angel taught to humans. Previously, I said that I didn't think of those things as necessarily bad things for humans to know, because I see it as just humans gaining more intellectual information. But I think that in this verse, it sounds as if the angels crossed a line. There are certain things that humans, I guess, are not supposed to know, or maybe there are certain things that are revealed to humans through their own experience, so based on their own timeline. Maybe the angels were messing up with that timeline and revealing the information too quickly for the humans. Jumping down to verse 11, it says, and the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. In the previous chapter, we read that a group of angels bounded together to defile themselves with humans because that leader, I think it was Samjazo, didn't want to bear the consequences of that unrighteous deed by himself. In this verse, it sounds like one of the angels, Azazel, is bearing all of the consequences for their actions, or he is to blame for all of that, which makes me question why is it only him when there were other angels involved? There were other angels that taught different things, different topics to the humans. Now jumping down again a couple of verses to verse 13. In the middle of this verse, it sounds like there is a hint as to when the day of judgment or the day of tribulation is. It says, and when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. It says that they are to be bounded for 70 generations before they are judged. I wonder if this day of judgment only applies to them, or is it the day of judgment that the Bible talks about, especially in the book of Revelation. I think it's been more than 70 generations since this event, so what's going on here? Enoch then makes an introduction in verse 22. In verse 22, it says that Enoch was in hiding. I don't know if that's literally in hiding. Was he hidden from all of other humans? How is it possible for him to be fully hidden from mankind? And it sounded like when he was in hiding, he was in contact with the angels. In this verse it says the watchers, which I'm assuming means the angels. The chapter then talks about Enoch carrying out the instructions of God. Enoch was supposed to go to the fallen angels and say certain things to them. My question is, why is Enoch a messenger for God and the fallen angels? Why is this human being a messenger? Why couldn't have another angel that was not fallen been a messenger? It's just odd to me that a random human being was chosen for this task when there are other supernatural creatures that could have carried out this task. But in this chapter it says that Enoch wrote down all of the petitions of the fallen angels, and in the last verse of this chapter it said that he reprimanded the watchers, which again makes me question, why did God give him the authority to do that? Why did a mere human being have so much access and so much contact with angels? Day 5 of reading the book of Enoch. Today's chapter is called Book of the Words of Righteousness. In the beginning of this chapter, Enoch's petition for the fallen angels was rejected by God. So the fallen angels are cursed. They are going to be thrown in fire, and their children will be destroyed. The children of the fallen angels were half human, half angels, and they were called giants, which made me remember the term Nephilim. I'm not sure if that's the correct way of pronouncing it, but I do recall reading about them in the Bible. I know that in the previous chapter it said that they will be destroyed, and I guess they will be destroyed through the flood that was sent down during Noah's time, and he had to build an ark. But giants make an appearance later on in the Bible. In the story of David and Goliath, Goliath was a giant. So did they reappear? Were there more fallen angels that had children with humans after this flood? Lots of questions to consider, but moving on in this chapter, Enoch then comes essentially face to face with God, or at least he's in the presence of God. He goes to this house and he describes this experience as being super overwhelming, and it was something that he had never experienced before. God tells Enoch a list of things that Enoch is supposed to tell the fallen angels. In verse 25, the angels were described as holy, spiritual, and living the eternal life. This makes me wonder, when the end time comes, and let's say that all the believers are reunited with God, or united with God, will we still have free will? Will we still have the ability to sin and disobey God? Because it sounds like the angels should not have had the ability to sin and obey God, because they were with God. They had eternal life already. They were considered holy. So how is it possible that they were able to sin or disobey God? Also in this verse it says that the angel lusted after flesh and blood. How were the angels, as supernatural creatures, able to lust? How do they have the capacity to experience lust when they were so holy and when they were with God? Moving on, in verse 28 it says that the giants who were made of spirit and flesh were considered evil spirits, and in verse 30 it says that they were very destructive forces. They afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth and cause trouble. The next line does not make too much sense for me. It says they take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst and cause offenses. So do they not eat if they don't take food? Or what do they eat as half human, half angels? But we know that the fate of these giants as well as the fallen angels is doomed. In verse 34, which is the last verse of this chapter, Enoch is supposed to tell them that you have no peace, which is really not a good thing to hear from God, the Lord Almighty. Day 7. I took the day off yesterday because it was Sunday. Today I read chapter 6. This chapter is called Taken by Angels, and this chapter and this entire book really reminds me of Greek mythology. In this verse, Enoch is brought to a place, we're not too sure where, but the creatures there are able to shapeshift, so they are able to appear as men. Enoch is then transported to different places where he sees a lot of different things, a lot of different aspects of nature that we normal humans don't. He is brought to a place of darkness and then a place of light. But the verse I want to point out is verse 4. It says that he was brought to living waters and to the fire of the west, which receives every setting of the sun. I'm not sure what the living waters refer to, and I'm not sure what fire of the west is referring to. But he continues his journey. He sees the 4 winds, and it seems like he's taken to multiple other places. I noticed that the number 7 came up a couple of times, and 7 is a number that comes up a lot in the Bible. The first time 7 shows up is in verse 13. It said that there were 7 mountains of magnificent stones. Towards the end of his journey in verse 19, it says, I saw their 7 stars like great burning mountains. So he saw 7 mountains, 7 stars. 7 just appears a lot in the Bible, and it seems like it's a number that is also repeated in this chapter. We already know the fate of the fallen angels who defile themselves with women, but in verse 23, we learn of the fate of the women who had relations with the angels. It says that they will become sirens. I'm wondering if the women knew that the angels were angels, or did they think that they were normal human beings? Also, who could blame these women? Why wouldn't anyone want an angel pursuing after them? Day 8, Chapter 7. This chapter is called The Holy Angels, and this chapter begins with a list of angels and their duties over mankind. It lists 7 angels, and again this number 7 pops up. Enoch is treated to a journey by these angels, and he's shown places where stars that have disobeyed God go, fallen angels where they go, and the souls of men where they are waiting until the day of judgment. First, Enoch visits a place he describes as chaotic and horrible. And this is a place where stars that have transgressed the commandment of the Lord are held. I did not know that stars could sin. How do stars disobey God? I thought that they are objects that don't have souls. They don't have the capacity to sin. They aren't living things. So this part of the chapter was super odd. Enoch then goes to a place that was more horrible than the last, and this is where the angels are kept as prisoners, the fallen angels who disobeyed the Lord. Actually, it doesn't specifically mention fallen angels, but I'm assuming they have to be fallen angels because otherwise they would be with God. As he continues his journey, he comes to a hollow place where the souls of men are being held, and Enoch said that he saw a dead man making suit, which I'm not sure what that phrase means, but the angel told Enoch that this is the spirit which went forth from Abel, whom his brother Cain slew, and he makes his suit against him till his seed is destroyed from the face of the earth, and his seed is annihilated from amongst the seed of men. This chapter is quite long. I think it's probably the longest chapter so far. I do want to point out some observations I have. Again, the number 7 comes up again and again, the 7 mountains, 7 stars, and in the beginning, there was the list of the 7 holy angels. I also noticed that Enoch really makes a point about him blessing God and giving thanks to God after seeing all of the things that he saw. In verse 27, he said, I blessed the Lord of glory and said, Blessed be my Lord, the Lord of righteousness, who ruleth forever. Then in verse 41 it says, Then blessed I the God of glory, the eternal King, who hath prepared such things for the righteous, and hath created them and promised to give to them. Verse 49, then I blessed the Lord of glory and set forth his glory and lauded him gloriously. Finally, in verse 68, the last verse of this chapter, it says, and as often as I saw, I blessed always the Lord of glory. And I continue to bless the Lord of glory who has wrought great and glorious wonders. Enoch is really making an emphasis that he is glorifying God and I guess praising God after seeing all of his mighty works. Actually, I need to search up who wrote this book. Did Enoch himself write this, or did he have someone record all of these events for him? Another thing I noticed was that the angels kept asking Enoch why he wanted to know certain things when Enoch asked questions. The first of this instance appears in verse 12. Uriel asks Enoch, Enoch, why dost thou ask, and why art thou eager for the truth? Then in verse 37, another angel, Michael, who is the leader of the angels, asks him, Enoch, why dost thou ask me regarding the fragrance of the tree, and why dost thou wish to learn the truth? I found it super odd that the angels were asking Enoch why he wanted to know those things. I would think that anyone who is being shown all of these things would have the same questions. If any human being were shown the depths of the earth, of hell, of heaven, I would think that every single one of us would have questions like these. So I found it odd to me as to why the angels would ask such a question. I thought that Enoch's curiosity was very natural. One last thing I want to point out is in verse 56. In this verse, Enoch takes a trip to the Garden of Righteousness, which after I read the few verses down from this verse, I realized that this is the Garden of Eden. I found it interesting that it went by a different name, the Garden of Righteousness, instead of the Garden of Eden, and according to this book, this garden still exists. That's it for this chapter, which I realize is the last chapter in the first part of the whole book of Enoch. So far, it's been very interesting. I feel like I'm reading Greek mythology. I would say that Enoch's description of everything he saw was not super detailed. He gave a very general description of the things he saw, and he made it sound very easy to describe, for him to describe everything he saw. From the testimonies of people I hear that had a supernatural experience, they usually find it very difficult to describe their experiences and the visions that they saw. But Enoch seemed to have no problem doing that. I didn't look too much into the background of the book of Enoch and why it was rejected by the Jews and the Christians, but I have a hunch as to why they don't accept this as a book that is valid. Although some parts are similar to the Bible, I think that overall it's very, very different. And the way that these events are recorded also highly contrasts with the way that events are recorded in the Bible. But I'm looking forward to the next book because there are parables coming up.